Welcome to the Darkstream. Voxday, voxday.net, and unauthorized.tv. I'm told the audio and video are good. DLive chat is rolling. Folks are rolling into the unauthorized live chat, and super chats are live. So it's evident with the events of the past few days that we are in the process of moving into what I think can only be considered a new and more dangerous phase, as the Ukraine counteroffensive has obviously failed. NATO's unstinting support for Ukraine is beginning to look shaky. And the Ukrainians are getting more desperate. And the Russians are beginning to not lose patience, because I think that to say that they're losing patience would be to wildly misinterpret the Soviet strategical approach. But they are clearly in the process of ratcheting up the pressure, squeezing a little bit more, and looking to make the transformation from a special military operation inside Ukraine to an actual war against NATO. Now this is already beginning to have some impact on us. The change was directly the result of the Soviet decision to abrogate the Ukrainian grain deal, which allowed Ukrainian grain to travel out through the Black Sea ports without any Russian interference. This was one of the indications that Russia was not at war with Ukraine. In wartime, you do not let the enemy freely send grain, food, supplies, etc., out of its ports freely. You sink the ships. You blow up the ports. None of that happened until first the Russians ended the grain deal, because the West and the United States and Ukraine were not living up to their agreed responsibilities. I cannot imagine that this was any sort of surprise whatsoever to the Russians, who have long held that the USA is agreement incapable. But because they weren't ready to take it any farther back then, and because there was a lot of favorable PR to gain with the African countries that need the grain, there was no reason for them not to give the West yet another chance. Needless to say, that opportunity to live up to its responsibilities was squandered. The Russians were within their rights to end the agreement, and less than 24 hours later, they launched a massive attack on Odessa that is believed to have completely shut down the port. Reportedly 60,000 tons of grain were destroyed. That's about the amount of one of the large ships that's used to transport it. So some people have theorized that one of the big ships was sunk. So if you want to know more, I'm going to put 3 videos up tonight. One is going to be the previous Darkstream. The next will be the next will probably be this Darkstream, and the third one will be the interview that I did with Piero San Giorgio about 2 weeks ago. And I think you'll probably find it's a little bit backwards, but I think that you'll probably find it interesting in light of what has happened since, because as you can see, events are proceeding the way that Piero and I expected them to from literally the first day that the special military operation began. You know, Piero San Giorgio is a student of history. I'm a student of military history. And one of the things that you regularly come across in reading about military history is the fact that no one ever seems to take Russia's military capability seriously. Napoleon didn't. Hitler didn't. What's really fascinating, I'm going to read some notes. I've been taking some notes while I've been reading the 2 volumes of Marshal Zhukov's memoirs. Now, Zhukov has been accused of not being, being a bit self-serving, like most people who write autobiographies are, or memoirs are. And maybe it's true, maybe it's not. And certainly his literary technique of reporting conversations as if he remembers them perfectly and is quoting everything, it's a little bit precious. But it's still very useful, especially, I find, his observations about the enemy. And it's very interesting to see how, from the Soviet perspective, which is essentially the Russian perspective, because they make their nods to communism and so forth, but it's very, very clear that they were defending Mother Russia. And it's very clear that they were not anywhere near as panicked as the common narrative of Operation Barbarossa has it. And in fact, this perception is further confirmed by the concern tone that the German commanders are taking in their communications relatively early on in the invasion. I mean, we're talking like, by September, the Germans are getting worried. Actually, I would say I think there might even be some from August. But anyhow, a couple things I took a couple notes that I'll share with you here. And these are just some of the interesting things that I think are relevant to what's happening today. It says, the Wehrmacht's defeats in the summer and autumn of 1943 destroyed whatever was left of the confidence that the satellites of Nazi Germany had in the Hitler regime. The fascist bloc began falling apart. No longer did Nazi Germany's allies in the neutral countries believe that Hitler's regime could escape total defeat. But the main thing was that the elements in Germany, which had brought Hitler to power and had supported him in every way during the years that followed, also lost trust in the Nazi leadership. Most Germans began to see that they had been dangerously deluded by the easy victories of the first period of the war, and that Germany could not stand up to the Soviet armed forces and the anti-Hitler coalition. Now, the reason I think that that's interesting is because it's exactly what we are seeing now. The reason that the BRICS alliance is growing, the reason that they're talking about doing things like setting up alternative currencies to the dollar, challenging the dollar's reserve status, is because they're not afraid of the U.S. anymore. The U.S. reserve currency status was always reinforced by U.S. military might. And, someone once said, well, what's the foundation of the dollar? And someone said, well, the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Well, what is the full faith and credit of the U.S. government? It's aircraft carriers and nuclear missile-armed submarines. So when you look at the way that Libya was attacked, when you look at the way that Iraq was attacked, when you look at the way that Afghanistan was attacked after 9/11 in lieu of Saudi Arabia, when you look at the fact that Europe has been and is still occupied by the U.S., by the U.S. military for the last 70 years, nobody's dared to challenge that. Now, all of them are going to start challenging it in the same way that people began to abandon Nazi Germany once the Germans no longer looked like the inevitable victors. And so I think that what we are going to see, no, we're not at the Newland in the bunker phase yet. Remember, he's talking about the big battles of 1943. Berlin didn't fall until, late 1944. But it was already clear what was going to happen, just like it's already clear that Ukraine, not only can't defeat Russia, that NATO can't defeat Russia, they can't even attack Russia. Here's some more interesting stuff in light of the recent counteroffensive that failed so drastically over the last month. First of all, here's something that is important to keep in mind whenever you're reading about, well, the Russians withdrew from this town. They retreated from this town. They're being driven back. Much time has passed since then, and he's talking about how Stalin, in the early stages of Barbarossa, Stalin wanted to know, or he told Zhukov and the other members of the Supreme Command Staff that they were going to defend Kiev. Zhukov and the general who was in charge of defending Kiev didn't want to do it. They thought that they should withdraw and leave it. He didn't think it was possible to hold it. But it's difficult. You can tell Stalin what you think, and Stalin's not necessarily going to pay attention to it. So he says, much time has passed since then, but I still cannot think of these events without being agitated. I believe that the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, he's talking about Stalin, was mistaken when he demanded that the command of the Southwestern Front hold the defense line west of the Dnieper and west of Kiev to the last possibility. I have said above what had happened of this. There's no denying the fact that even the thought that Kiev might be lost was painful for every Soviet person, but in deciding the fate of the Ukraine's capital, account should have been taken of all the military and political factors. War is war, and if it is necessary, if a large army group is threatened with encirclement and destruction, it must be rapidly withdrawn from under enemy blows to avoid serious defeat and unnecessary losses. So what that tells us about the Soviet military doctrine, remember, this is one of the greatest Soviet generals of all time, hero of the Soviet Union, marshal of the Soviet Union, defeated a number of great German generals. And so then he talks about, he talks about the importance of preserving your forces. Don't allow your forces to be wasted. Get them out of trouble. What we're seeing with NATO is exactly the opposite. They're just throwing away tens of thousands of men. They're just throwing away incredible quantities of armor and light armor for nothing. They're accomplishing nothing because they're not fighting a war. They're playing a political game and using the troops and the munitions to send messages. This is not the way that anyone has ever won a war. So let's see here. Now this is where it gets, I think, very interesting. And it really relates to the current counteroffensive. On November 16th through 18th, our troops had some very grueling engagements. Paying no attention to his losses, the enemy repeatedly attacked our positions, trying at all costs to break through to Moscow with his tank spearheads. However, the depth of our artillery and anti-tank defenses, as well as excellent cooperation between all fighting forces, prevented the army from penetrating the defense lines of the 16th Army. It would deliberately and gradually withdraw from action and retire to positions held by our artillery, where it would offer resistance again, repulsing the fierce attacks of the Nazi troops. So what he's talking about there is pretty much the same thing that they did in the recent counteroffensive. It was, in fact, even the results are kind of similar. On December 1st, the German forces unexpectedly effected a breakthrough in the central sector at the junction between the 5th and 33rd Armies, and began advancing along the highway towards Kubinka. However, they were halted near the village of Akulovo by the 32nd Rifle Division, whose artillery destroyed some of their tanks. Many more enemy tanks were blown up on minefields. Again, sound familiar? This sounds exactly like what we just saw happen in the last month. Reeling back with heavy losses, the German armored units turned to Golitsino, where they were utterly routed by the front reserve forces and units of the 5th and 33rd Armies. The breakthrough was ultimately halted on December 4th, the enemy leaving on the battlefield over 10,000 dead and 50 tanks and a great deal of other combat material destroyed. So there's really no excuse for the NATO commanders who thought they were going to send 300-400 tanks and force a breakthrough and somehow drive the Russian forces back. They did, unlike the Nazis at least managed to break through. NATO couldn't even do that. And they lost more than 10,000 men and more than 50 tanks. So when you look at the fact that the events of exactly, 1943 says the events of exactly 80 years ago are being repeated, only with even less success. First time tragedy, second time farce. Only the farce is arguably even more tragic than the tragedy. None of this is or should be a surprise. I think you can make a case for the fact that, or for the idea, the concept that Nuland and Zelensky and those who are aiding and abetting them are actually seeking the deaths of as many Ukrainian men as they can. I think it's at least possible. I think that's more credible than the idea that they could ever have won. Remember, Ukraine had one of the biggest and most experienced armies in Europe. Look at the size sometime, just of the number of men. The U.S. Army isn't really that big. Not when you look at the number of tasks it has to perform. Let me see let's see how many are, what is the actual size of the U.S. Army? U.S. Army total personnel. Military force numbers. Okay. So U.S. Army active duty is 480,000. And that was the size Ukraine. Armed Forces of Ukraine. I guess what are they, 200-300? active personnel, 250,000. So the U.S. Army is less than twice the size of the Ukrainian army, which was already destroyed. They're now on their third army. And so there is zero possibility, zero, that the U.S. could win in Russia, even if it sent every single soldier in the army to Ukraine, to Europe. You know, and it could be a calculated depopulation scheme. I mean, we've just seen an active depopulation scheme with COVID. You know, what's remarkable to me is that the Ukrainian people put up with it. I mean, I don't think that we're very far away from Ukrainian forces revolting against their own officers, against their own, well, it's not their own, but against the Kiev regime. Ladumba says they were the least vaccinated in Europe, probably because they were being prepared for this action. Didn't do them any good. And so, you know, now that the grain deal has been abrogated, and that's already affecting us. We're already seeing gas prices starting to rise. You're going to see food prices probably start to rise. You know, this is going to be a serious thing, just as it is now. And so, you know, the Russians are obviously going to be stepping up their attacks. Deplorbear says, I have a Ukrainian friend. They hate Russians. I have no doubt that that's true. But your friend hasn't just witnessed hundreds of thousands of his countrymen thrown into a meat grinder to no purpose or avail. Yeah. And so, no matter how much they might hate the Russians in the abstract, I think that they're going to be a lot more concerned with saving their own lives. Anyhow, it's pretty clear that the Russians are going to be launching some sort of offensive of their own in the relatively near future. And I think it's going to be very educational to see what the differences are. I don't think it's going to be, you know, the big 1943, 1944 style super pocket curse type things, right? But I do think that, you know, you're going to see some more important, you know, instead of areas like Bakhmut and so forth, you're going to see more important strategic objectives being taken. And then the question is, what do the Poles do? You know, Putin's already issued an implicit warning. He talked about how Western Poland was given to Poland as a gift by the Soviet Union. And I think that that is a warning to Poland that if they're going to get uppity and follow the example of Ukraine, they are going to follow the example of Ukraine. Buzz Saber says, I have had some Ukrainians call me a Mongol for disagreeing that Putin is mad. Well, if Putin is mad, what does that make Zelensky? Retarded? You know, if he's mad, then why has he systematically destroyed every attempt by the US, the European countries, and NATO to harm the Russian economy and to bring about the defeat of Russia. Russia is stronger than it has been since the fall of the Soviet Union. Third parties are flocking to Brixia. And here's the other thing. Don't forget the significance of this. Russia is doing this essentially alone. Russia is beating the entire combined forces of NATO. They've taken everything that the US and Germany and France and Spain and Poland and every other country in Europe, plus Australia and so forth, and wiped it out. They've taken losses, of course they have. But it's really amazing to see that they've done all this without once needing to call in their allies. Do you really think that they couldn't bring in 100,000 Iranians, 100,000 North Koreans, 250,000 Chinese? The U.S. is not going to get directly involved, and the reason that the U.S. is being very shy about sending the promised F-16s and all that sort of thing is because now even the neoclowns understand they're not going to win. Russia may be fighting alone, but it isn't alone. If push comes to shove, Turkey will side with Russia. Don't forget, Erdogan plays his own game. Space Bunny asked me about that today. I think she'd been having a conversation with someone about it, and people were all excited because Erdogan had, sent a signal that he's breaking with Russia because they're not going to stand in the way of Sweden joining NATO. Okay, first of all, Erdogan serves Turkey and himself. He doesn't care at all about any of this stuff. But he does remember, as most people tend to forget, that the U.S. launched a coup against him and against his government about 8 years ago. It's also possible that that big earthquake was actually an attack on Turkey with the geoweapon. So he is not on their side. He is not on the side of the U.S. Now, is it in his benefit to openly side, to break with NATO, break with the U.S. and all that stuff? Of course not. What Erdogan's going to do is he's going to stick with NATO and the U.S. as long as it keeps bringing in money and resources. He's going to milk every last drop out of Turkey's NATO alliance right up until Vladimir Putin says, hey, big man, it's time to change sides. And then he will. That's my prediction. Yes, I'm aware that Russia and Turkey are historical enemies. I'm aware of the wars of the Ottoman Empire and Russia, like 8 wars in a single century. But who cares? He doesn't care about Sweden being in NATO. If the Swedes want to end up getting occupied by Russia, well, that's really up to them. But Sam says they haven't even sent a ton of Russians. They've sent a lot of minorities and mercenaries. No, well, they have they have they have lost a fair number of Russians. There's no question. But most of those Russians that are lost were actually, former Ukrainians in the Donbass militias. It's a bit strange to have been talking about the civil war and the militias, and then of course, whether it's the Chechens, whether it's Wagner, what they've been using as light infantry shock troops are not the Russian regulars. That's the amazing thing, is that until this recent counteroffensive, the Russians were winning using third-tier troops. Would Turkey be asked to kick out the U.S. military bases? No, I don't think so, because I think it's advantageous to Russia to have Turkey able to deny the U.S. the use of those bases and the use of all the equipment that's at those bases. I think that we'll know that Turkey is about to switch sides or about to break up, leave NATO, if those bases are evacuated by the U.S. I mean, think about how useful it would be to have all the troops and everything, and all the planes and all the equipment there in Turkey, and then they switch sides and surround it and blow the runways and deny all of that equipment in a single fell swoop. Are you familiar with the Boer prophecy of a world war where most white nations are destroyed and Turkey betrays Russia? No, I am not. I'm very dubious about that. How can Turkey betray Russia when Turkey is formally allied and playing host to the NATO forces? I mean, Putin's a very careful guy. He's not counting on anything out of Turkey and Erdogan. He handles Turkey delicately. When Turkey shot down that MiG, he didn't make a big deal of it. It's one thing that's very clear about the Russians and the Russian leadership is that they're patient. They don't go off half-cocked. Even if it drives people crazy, they're like, when are they going to do something? When are they going to do this? When are they going to do that? Well, again, why should they? If the enemy is dumb enough to just keep walking up and allowing himself to be easily wiped out, I find these numbers very, very difficult to believe, but the casualty ratios are off the charts. They're more indicative of a colonial era war or a colonial era battle between unarmed natives and first-tier European militaries than anything. 20-Buck Bear is very generous with the super chat and says, "Thanks, Vox. Please put this towards a nice Rioja." I have just the Rioja in mind. I'm a big fan of Faustino 7, but since you put it that way, I think we'll have to think about splurging for a bottle of Faustino 1. That's the good stuff. So, thank you, 20-Buck Bear. At this rate, BRICS can just wait for the U.S. economy to collapse. Precisely. China is the real winner in all of this because this is costing them nothing. All they have to do is keep saying, we favor peace and everybody talking to each other. And they're like, but one of your embassies was damaged in the Odessa. One of your consulates was damaged in the Odessa bombing. I mean, it's really funny. I have to read you this. It actually made me laugh when I read it. As you know, one of the things that I like to read is the Chinese Foreign Ministry press releases. And this is the this is the Foreign Ministry spokesperson's remarks on China's Consulate General in Odessa being shaken during Russian airstrike on Ukraine. This was just a day ago. Question. Sources say the Russian military's drone and missile attack on the Ukrainian city of Odessa on July 20th shook the Chinese Consulate General there, causing damage to the outer wall surface and some window panes. Can you confirm this? Has China made démarches to Russia? So what they're trying to do here is like stir up some antagonism between Russia and China. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson says, an explosion happened near China's Consulate General in Odessa. The blast wave shook off parts of the wall surface and window panes. The consulate staff had long left the premises, interesting, and no one was hurt. China is closely following the developments and staying in touch with the parties concerned. We will take all measures necessary to keep Chinese institutions and nationals safe in Ukraine. So what I found interesting about that is, number one, how come no one was at the consulate in Odessa? Oh, and then Reuters, listen to this, Reuters it keeps it up. They keep trying to push this whole concept because they're desperate to split Russia and China. Reuters. A building of the Chinese consulate in Odessa was damaged by a Russian missile and drone attack yesterday. Does this mean that China will now condemn the attack on the Ukrainian city? Also, has China launched any complaint at all with the Russian side about the attack? Mao Ning, she's one of their lead spokespeople. We have given information on the explosion near China's Consulate General in Odessa. We will stay in communication with the parties concerned and take all measures necessary to keep Chinese institutions and nationals in Ukraine safe. So that's a pretty straightforward non-answer. Will China condemn the attack on Odessa? No. Has China launched any complaint at all with the Russian side about the attack? No. In fact, when they said that, I thought it was interesting, the previous answer, all of the personnel had long left the building. So it sounds to me like the Russians said, hey, we're going to hit Odessa. Might want to get out of Dodge. Then Reuters comes back. With the Chinese consulate in Odessa being damaged by the Russian attack, if there is no criticism over Russian damage of the building, is non-criticism now the policy for any future similar cases should Chinese missions abroad be damaged or hit in any way during an attack of some sort? Mao Ning. On the Ukraine crisis, our position is consistent and clear. We will continue to facilitate the political settlement of the crisis. We are closely following relevant developments and staying in communication with the parties concerned. We will take all measures necessary to keep Chinese institutions and nationals in Ukraine and anywhere else in the world safe. So the Western media is desperately trying to get them to give the media some way to claim that China is breaking with Russia. And they're even saying, well, if you don't condemn them for damaging your building, then you can't condemn anyone else. The Chinese like, yeah, whatever. You know? The gray man says, it's very clear that even a lot of the folks here don't read or understand Simplicius. I don't know what you're referring to there. I do read Simplicius. I don't think he's particularly hard to understand. But maybe you're referring to, let's see. Yeah, I'm a fan of He says Simplicius is better than the overload of nonstop Telegram channels that don't have the understand or yeah, he's very good. I think that um, since the Saker stopped writing on the situation, I think Simplicius has some of the best stuff out there. I think I've linked to his blog many times. I don't think that he is correct all the time. I mean, I don't think. Well, first of all, no one's correct all the time, and you know, some of his predictions have panned out very well, others not so much. Um, I don't follow the tactical or even the operational side of the stuff. I'm looking more at uh, the economic and the global consequences. I pay a lot of attention to China's attitude, and I think China's attitude. I think my original read on China's attitude has been proven to be true, as we've seen with these ridiculous attempts to ridiculous attempts by the global media to get China to somehow break with Russia. Um, I disagree with you, Statics. Here he says the time to separate China and Russia and choose one to ally with was 10 to 20 years ago. That was never possible. You are forgetting, I think, that the U.S. does not represent its own interests. The U.S. government does not represent the interests of the American people. This is a war being led by the neoclowns on the basis of global homo, or for the benefit of global homo. NATO is the military wing of global homo, and the U.S. military is part of that. But how were they ever going to ally with Russia after the neocons and their allies had financially raped Russia for 20 years? The Russians tried to be allies with the Americans, and they got used by the same people that are ruling over the Americans. They know that. I mean, you've heard Putin talk about the empire of lies. You've heard Lavrov talk about the U.S. being agreement incapable. And so Russia was not an option. China was also not an option. Do you know how many Communist Party officials have been disciplined by the Xi government in the last, I think, 6 years? Last 5 years. Over 670,000. China has already essentially fought a bureaucratic civil war. The pro-Western faction lost. Think about that. That's the equivalent of the U.S. arresting all the police across the entire country and the FBI. And all of those people were disciplined up to the level of the equivalent of a Supreme Court judge, to levels that included execution. That's how serious the Xi government has been about attacking corruption in China. Does that sound like a government that was ever going to be amenable to allying with the U.S. government? No chance. So all of this strategizing that you see in places like foreign policy and whatever, they just don't have any relationship to reality. China knows the U.S. government is their enemy. Russia knows the U.S. government is their enemy. That's why they understand it to the point that they're banning things like transgender mutilation and LGBT whatever propaganda. Russia's openly doing the things that Americans should be doing. China never permitted it in the first place. They're not Americans. The Chinese are not Christians. But they are both moving in the direction of the good and the true at the same time that the U.S. government is leading the people of America, the people of Europe, towards hell and death and disease and destruction. Yeah. And there's no question that NATO's going to lose. There was never any question that Japan and Germany were going to lose. In fact, I thought Stalin's reaction to when, let me see if I can find this. Let's see. Here we go. Think about this and how early it is. On December 11th, 1941, the Hitler government declared war against the United States. By this act, Hitler evidently wanted to accomplish two things. First, he wanted to show that Germany, ignoring her losses, was becoming even stronger and was capable of carrying on the war not only against the Soviet Union and Britain, but against the United States as well. Second, he wanted to quickly push Japan into action against the USA in order to ensure that the United States would not be involved in the war against Germany in Europe. When Stalin heard the news, he smiled ironically. Interesting. What forces and what resources can Germany use in fighting against the United States? For this kind of war, she has neither long-distance air strength nor appropriate naval strength. So, Stalin understood Germany had no chance of winning. In 1941. What was that? That was December 11th, 1941. So July, August, September, October. Within 6 months of the launch of our Operation Barbarossa, Stalin understood that Hitler had no chance of winning. Why? The logistical math. Look at the total industrial capacity of China plus Russia plus Iran. You can add everything else up. It doesn't match it. It doesn't come close to it. China already has a navy that is bigger than the U.S. Navy. Far more ships. The number of drones that can be produced, and drones are increasingly important. The fundamental problem, that's one way to look at it. Let me give you another way to look at it that points to exactly the same conclusion. NATO's way of war has always depended upon air supremacy. But air supremacy is no longer possible. We have essentially reached the end of manned aircraft. It's over. People may not have accepted that yet, but it is over. That's why the F-16s are irrelevant. They can send F-16s, they can send F-22s, they can send F-35s. None of it will make it will make no more difference than the Me-163 and the Me-262, the two first jet fighters made in World War II. Because the air defenses, the missile defenses now, are simply too effective. And it's going to get worse. Because laser air defenses are faster than missile defenses. Once they figure out how to, remember, good air defenses are highly mobile. They're put on these big trucks. Well, once they get the point where they can fit a laser generator on a truck that size, you can drive the truck around and the lasers will instantly take down dozens of planes, helicopters, drones, etc. I think that the era of drone warfare is going to be very, very short. Because, yes, you can manufacture a bunch of cheap drones. You can fly drones faster because they don't have a human in charge. But no powered drone can outfly a laser. So, the laser anti-air technology is not there yet, but it's gonna get developed sooner or later. So anyhow, that's my take on things. Like I said, I think we're entering a new and more dangerous phase. I hope you'll be aware of this. I hope you'll, stay out of trouble. Maybe add a little bit of prepping at the end. It never hurts to have a few weeks of food, a few rounds of ammo. So, let's see here. Sam Freeman sends a super chat before I go. Opportunist politicians versus highly successful KGB officer. Repeat until sinks in. Yeah, I mean, there's so many other ways you could look at it, but everything always points to the same solution, points to the same result, and that is the defeat of NATO, the breakup of NATO, and the shockwaves that is going to send throughout the entire global system. I'm Vox Day. This is the Darkstream.